A storm, a stray, and a second chance. The wind howled through the darkened streets of Willow Creek, rattling the old wooden shutters on Eleanor Ellie Thompson's small country home. Rain pelted against the windows in relentless waves, a steady rhythm that echoed the quiet ache in her heart. She had lived in this house for over 40 years, first as a young wife, then as a mother raising 2 sons, and now, alone. The walls carried whispers of laughter, of love, of memories long past, but on nights like this, they seemed empty. Ellie set down her tea with a sigh, wrapping the thick wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. The storm outside mirrored the weight she carried inside, a loneliness she had learned to live with, but never quite made peace with. The house felt too big now, too quiet, a stark contrast to the life it once held. She turned off the lamp and made her way toward the hallway, ready to retreat to her room, when a thump echoed from outside. Her breath caught. She froze, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the howling wind and the distant creak of tree branches swaying against the storm. But then, there it was again, a soft, muffled sound. Ellie's heart thudded in her chest as she approached the front door, every cautious step magnifying the eerie quiet of the house. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the bolt and pulled the door open just enough to peek outside. A cardboard box sat on her porch, rain-soaked and sagging at the corners. It hadn't been there earlier. She hesitated. In a town as small as Willow Creek, surprises were rare and strangers even rarer. But something about the sight of the box, abandoned and trembling under the downpour, made her pulse quicken. Then she heard it, a tiny whimper. Ellie's breath hitched as she stepped fully onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the rain. Bending down, she carefully peeled back the damp flaps of the box. Inside, curled into a fragile ball, was a tiny, shivering puppy. It was small, far too small, with matted fur and trembling limbs. Its thin body pressed against the soaked cardboard for warmth, its little chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. But what startled Ellie most was its eyes, one a deep, stormy blue, the other a rich, earthy brown. For a second, the storm around her faded. The puppy lifted its head weakly, its mismatched eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Recognition. A connection so sudden, so unexplainable, it left her breathless. Her gaze flicked downward. A crumpled piece of paper was tucked inside the box, nearly unreadable from the rain. With careful fingers, she picked it up, smoothing out the damp wrinkles. The ink had smudged, but one sentence stood out. "It won't survive. Please do what's right." Ellie's throat tightened. The puppy let out another weak whimper, its tiny body twitching from the cold. It was waiting, for what she didn't know, but in that moment, she did. With a slow, steadying breath, Ellie reached into the box. The puppy flinched at first, but made no attempt to resist as she carefully lifted it against her chest, tucking its frail body under the folds of her warm sweater. Its heart pounded against hers, fast and uneven. For years, Ellie had thought her heart was too tired to beat this way again. But standing there, in the middle of a storm, holding something so small and helpless, something shifted inside her. She wasn't entirely sure who was saving who. Stepping back into the warmth of her home, she whispered softly, "You're safe now, little one." And for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The battle for Brody's life. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and pine as morning light streamed through the lace curtains in Ellie's kitchen. The old wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she carefully cradled the tiny, trembling puppy in her arms. Wrapped in a soft towel, the little thing barely moved, its shallow breaths pressing against her palm like delicate whispers of life. She had spent most of the night by the fireplace, watching over him, Or was it a him? She hadn't even checked. All she knew was that this fragile soul had been left on her porch, discarded like an afterthought, and she wasn't about to let him slip away. The puppy stirred slightly, a soft whimper escaping its throat, and Ellie's heart clenched. "You're still here, huh?" she murmured, running a careful finger over its tiny head. She reached for her phone with her free hand, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. A moment later, the line clicked, and a warm, familiar voice answered. "Ellie? What's wrong?" Dr. Matthew Collins had been the town's veterinarian for as long as she could remember. He was younger than she was, somewhere in his 40s, but had taken over his father's practice when the elder Collins retired. "I need your help, Matt," she said, glancing down at the bundle in her arms. "I found a puppy on my porch last night. It's not in good shape." A pause, then his tone softened. "Bring it in. I'll be here." The small clinic smelled of antiseptic and fresh hay. Matt kept a few rescued animals in the back, waiting for adoption. Ellie stepped inside, tightening her hold on the puppy as a bell jingled overhead. Matt glanced up from his paperwork and immediately frowned when he saw the state of the tiny creature in her arms. "Oh, Ellie." Gently, she placed the puppy on the exam table, watching as Matt's experienced hands worked over its frail body. He examined its ribs, far too visible beneath the patchy fur, checked its heartbeat, then carefully pried open its tiny mouth to inspect its gums. Ellie felt a growing knot in her stomach as he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's a male," he said first, giving her at least one answer. "But Ellie, he's not just underweight. He's severely malnourished." Her hands curled into fists. Matt continued, his voice gentle but firm. "His spine is deformed. I can feel a curve along his back and his front legs." He gestured to the slightly bowed limbs. "They're weak. He'll have trouble walking if he ever manages it at all." Ellie swallowed hard. "But he's alive. For now." She heard what he wasn't saying. For now, but maybe not for long. Matt hesitated before speaking again. "Ellie, I need to be honest with you. Puppies like this, the ones born with deformities, especially from bad breeding situations, don't always make it." Something in his voice made her stomach turn. "Are you saying I should—" "I'm saying it's your choice," he interrupted gently. "But this won't be easy. He'll need round-the-clock care, constant monitoring, and even then, there's no guarantee." Ellie looked down at the tiny dog, at the soft rise and fall of his chest. He looked so small, so defenseless, but he had survived the night. She reached out, running a finger along his head, and the puppy shifted, nuzzling into her touch like he already knew he belonged to her. That was all the answer she needed. She lifted her chin. "I'm keeping him." Matt studied her for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. "Didn't think you'd say anything else." Back home, Ellie transformed her quiet house into a makeshift puppy rehabilitation center. She set up a warm bed by the fireplace, gathering old blankets and a heating pad to keep him comfortable. She learned how to feed him with a syringe when he refused to eat on his own, setting alarms every 2 hours to ensure he got enough nourishment. It was exhausting. It was relentless. But she had done this before. Not for a dog, but for Jim. The memory hit her one evening as she sat on the floor, cradling Brody, she had finally given him a name, against her chest. Jim had been sick for a long time, and she had cared for him the same way, watching over him, feeding him, waiting for signs of improvement, fearing the worst with every breath. Brody whimpered in his sleep, his tiny body twitching. Ellie kissed the top of his head, whispering, "You're a fighter, aren't you?" He didn't answer, of course, but the next morning, for the first time, he lifted his head on his own. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. "Did you hear about Ellie?" Mrs. Parker whispered to the cashier at the general store. She's nursing some poor broken puppy back to health. She always was stubborn, Old Man Harris grunted. It's just a dog. She's setting herself up for heartbreak. Even Matt voiced his concerns again, though he wasn't unkind about it. Ellie, you know I support you, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that he's going to make it, Ellie interrupted, her voice unwavering. She refused to let anyone, not her neighbors, not her friends, not even fate, decide Brody's future for him. The early morning sun cast long golden beams across Ellie's modest living room, filtering through lace curtains as the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the crisp autumn air. She had barely taken her first sip when she felt it, the unmistakable weight of small eyes watching her. Brody sat just a few feet away, his mismatched gaze locked onto her every movement. It had been 3 weeks since Ellie had found the little pup abandoned on her porch, and though he was still small, far too small, there was an unmistakable change in him. His once weak limbs were stronger, his fur was beginning to shine, and his tail, which had barely moved when she first brought him home, now gave a slow, deliberate wag when she spoke to him. "Good morning, little one," she murmured, setting her mug down and kneeling beside him. Brody responded with a small whimper, shifting closer, his head tilting slightly in curiosity. Then, something unexpected happened. Brody lifted his front paw, just barely, just for a second, before placing it down again, his tiny frame trembling from the effort. Ellie's breath caught. She had spent hours every day working with him, gently encouraging his legs to support his weight, helping him take even the smallest of steps. But this was the first time he had tried on his own. Her heart swelled. "You're a fighter," she whispered, running a gentle hand along his head. Brody pressed into her touch, his tiny tail giving another wag, stronger this time. But as she looked at him, something unsettling tugged at the back of her mind. For the past few nights, she had woken up to the feeling of being watched. At first, she thought it was Brody. But when she checked, she found him sound asleep beside her. It was probably just her imagination, probably. Yet, as Brody sat there now, his mismatched eyes focused on her with unwavering intensity, she couldn't help but wonder, was it him that had been watching over her, or was he sensing something she couldn't? At first, Ellie dismissed them as coincidence. She would find Brody suddenly tense in the middle of the living room, ears perked, staring at something invisible beyond the walls. Sometimes, he would let out a soft growl, not a frightened one, but a warning. Then, one evening, as Ellie was folding laundry, Brody suddenly lunged toward the front door, barking sharply. It was the first time he had barked. Her heart leaped into her throat. Setting down the towel, she rushed to the door, pressing her eye against the peephole. Nothing. The yard was empty. The streetlights flickered softly against the pavement. There was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. But Brody wouldn't move from his spot. His small body stood rigid, his ears pulled back, his tail completely still. A shiver ran down Ellie's spine. Her fingers hovered over the lock, debating whether to check outside, but something in her gut told her not to. Instead, she whispered, "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go to bed." Brody hesitated for a moment longer before finally stepping back. But even as she carried him upstairs, she could feel it, a lingering unease that refused to fade. Days passed, and though Brody continued to grow stronger, his strange behavior only intensified. He was no longer just watching her. He was watching something else. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves as Ellie stepped onto her porch. She cradled a warm mug of coffee in her hands, the steam rising in soft tendrils as she gazed across her quiet property. Everything seemed peaceful. Too peaceful. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling from the night before, the heavy presence of someone, or something, lingering just beyond sight. The footsteps, the way Brody had reacted, the silent, lingering fear that curled in the pit of her stomach. But now, in the daylight, everything looked normal. If not for Brody, she might have convinced herself she had imagined it all. The little dog sat beside her, small but sturdy, his mismatched eyes scanning the yard with a level of focus that sent a chill down her spine. His tail didn't wag, his ears remained pricked, and every so often he let out a low, almost inaudible huff, as if warning an unseen presence that he was watching. Ellie reached down and ruffled his fur. "You're still on edge, huh?" Brody didn't look at her. That was answer enough. She took a slow sip of coffee, her free hand absently scratching behind Brody's ears. And then, a sound. Distant, subtle, a snap of a twig. Ellie stiffened. Brody's entire body tensed beneath her touch. Her eyes flicked toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but the uneasy sensation crept back into her bones. She had lived on this land for decades. She knew every rustle, every crack, every whisper of nature. But this was different. Brody let out a soft, warning growl. Ellie exhaled slowly, trying to calm her pounding heart. It was just an animal, a deer maybe. Still, she found herself tightening her robe around her body as she murmured, "Come on, Brody. Let's go inside." As she stepped back into the warmth of her home, she could feel it. The weight of unseen eyes following her every move. Ellie didn't tell anyone at first. It wasn't that she didn't trust Matt. He had already come to check the property once before. But she didn't want to sound paranoid. The last thing she needed was people whispering about the old widow who'd finally lost her mind. But Brody knew, and he never let her forget it. Every night, just as the world settled into quiet, he would station himself near the front door. He wasn't restless. He wasn't pacing or whining. He was waiting, watching, guarding. Ellie tried to ignore it. She told herself she was imagining the way he never quite relaxed anymore, how his ears twitched at even the softest noises, how he slept in short bursts rather than curling up in deep rest like he once did. She told herself she was being foolish. But then, it happened again. The first knock was so soft Ellie almost didn't hear it. She had been in bed, half lost in sleep, the weight of exhaustion finally settling into her bones. But Brody had heard. He leaped from his spot at the foot of her bed, his body rigid as he stared at the door. Then came the second knock. Louder. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She slowly pushed herself up, her fingers tightening around the blanket as her mind raced. No one knocked on her door this late. Ever. Brody let out a low, guttural growl. Ellie reached for her phone. Her hands trembled as she typed a message to Matt. Someone's outside. She hadn't even pressed send when another knock came. Harder, more insistent. Brody barked. Loud, fierce, unrelenting. Then, silence. Ellie's entire body was frozen. She could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat, the sound deafening in the quiet room. Brody remained at the door, his tail raised like a flag, his eyes locked on something she couldn't see. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the sound of footsteps retreating. Ellie exhaled shakily. Brody didn't move from the door for the rest of the night. And Ellie? She didn't sleep. By the time the sun rose, Ellie had made a decision. She called Matt. An hour later, he pulled up in his truck, stepping out with a look of quiet concern. "I checked the front porch," he said after a long pause. "Whoever knocked last night, they left something." Ellie's stomach twisted. "What?" Matt exhaled, pulling something from his pocket. A small, crumpled note. The words scrawled across it in uneven, hurried letters made her blood run cold. "Why do you keep locking your doors?" Ellie felt the air leave her lungs. Brody, sensing her distress, pressed his small body against her leg. She ran a trembling hand through her hair. Matt placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Ellie, I want you to come stay with me for a few days, just until we figure this out." She almost said yes. Almost. But then she looked down at Brody, the little dog who had been left for dead, the one who had fought for every breath, the one who had protected her when no one else had. She wasn't leaving. She was staying and fighting. Matt didn't like it. He insisted on installing new locks, setting up cameras, even calling in a favor with the local sheriff to increase patrols in the area. Ellie let him, but deep down, she knew. The real protection wasn't coming from any lock or camera or police cruiser. It was coming from Brody, and she was right. The final warning came 3 nights later. Ellie had just finished locking up when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving outside. Not a knock, not footsteps. Something dragging. She swallowed, stepping back, fingers tightening around her phone. Brody, as always, was the first to react. He let out a sound Ellie had never heard before, a growl so deep, so primal, it sent chills down her spine. Then, bang! Something slammed against the back door. Ellie barely had time to react before Brody charged. For such a small dog, he moved with terrifying speed, barking with an intensity that shook the walls. He threw his weight against the door, his growls now an almost continuous snarl. Ellie's hands fumbled with her phone. 911. She barely managed to whisper, "There's someone outside," before Brody's barking reached a fever pitch. Then, silence. Ellie's pulse thundered in her ears. The dispatcher's voice was in the background saying something, but Ellie wasn't listening, because at that moment she knew. Whoever had been outside had left. Because of Brody. The police arrived 15 minutes later. They found footprints leading to the tree line, a few scratches on the door. Nothing more. But Ellie didn't need proof. She knew what had happened. As the officers left, as Matt stayed behind to talk her into moving one last time, she looked down at Brody, the dog no one had wanted, the one they had told her wouldn't survive. And yet, here he was. Strong. Fierce. Heron. She knelt beside him, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "You saved me," she whispered. Brody nuzzled into her touch, his mismatched eyes shining. And in that moment, Ellie realized something. She hadn't rescued him that night in the storm. He had come to rescue her. The events of that night lingered like a shadow in Ellie's mind, refusing to fade with the passing days. The police had come and gone. The scratches on the back door had been noted, the footprints leading into the woods documented. But the feeling of unease remained. Brody, however, was unchanged, watchful, protective, but not afraid, and in some strange way, that gave Ellie comfort. She had spent her entire life believing she was strong enough to handle anything. When Jim passed, she didn't ask for help. When the loneliness settled into her bones, she endured it. But now, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. Brody was always there, curled at her feet as she drank her morning coffee, standing beside her as she watered the garden, following her from room to room as if making sure she never strayed too far. He wasn't just a dog, he was her shadow, her protector, and Ellie realized, with an ache she hadn't expected, that she needed him just as much as he needed her. Though the fear from that night had settled into the walls of her home, life didn't stop. Brody still needed care. His legs, once weak and wobbly, had grown stronger with each passing day. Ellie had spent countless hours helping him learn to walk, fashioning a makeshift harness to support his weight. And now he could run, not fast, not effortlessly, but when he moved, he did so with purpose. Ellie watched as he bounded across the yard one afternoon, his tail wagging wildly as he chased a falling leaf. A laugh bubbled in her throat, the first real laugh she had allowed herself in months. Brody skidded to a stop and turned to face her, his mismatched eyes shining with something that looked suspiciously like pride. You're showing off now, huh? She teased. Brody let out a happy bark, then bolted back toward her, his small body pressing against her legs as if expecting praise. Ellie knelt, running her fingers through his fur. "I knew you could do it," she murmured. And she meant it. From the moment she found him, she had known. He was never broken. He had just needed someone to believe in him, the way he had believed in her that night. The knock on the door that afternoon made Ellie pause. For a brief, irrational moment, she felt the same cold fear from that night creep down her spine. But then she heard a familiar voice. "Ellie, it's me." She let out a slow breath, forcing a smile as she opened the door to Matt. He stepped inside, his gaze immediately falling to Brody, who had stationed himself between them, not growling, not barking, just watching. Matt smirked. "I think he still doesn't trust me." Ellie chuckled. "He'll warm up to you eventually." "Not likely." Matt knelt down, offering his hand. "Hey there, buddy." Brody didn't move. Ellie hid a smile. "He's protective." Matt nodded. "Good. You need that." His voice had softened, and when Ellie met his gaze, she saw the unspoken words there. He was still worried. "I'm fine, Matt," she said before he could bring it up. His jaw tightened. "Are you?" Ellie hesitated. Was she? The fear had faded, but the awareness remained. She still double-checked the locks at night, still woke up at the slightest noise, and yet she wasn't afraid, because Brody was there. She turned to the little dog who had settled beside her, his mismatched eyes still fixed on Matt. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've never felt safer." Word of Brody's remarkable transformation had spread through town. People who once whispered about the strange little dog now stopped Ellie on the street to ask about him. "How's the pup?" Mrs. Parker asked at the general store one afternoon. "He's doing great," Ellie said with a smile. "I heard he saved you," the woman continued, leaning in slightly. Ellie hesitated. Did she believe that? Her mind flashed back to that night, the growls, the fierce, unwavering stance Brody had taken at the door, the way he had refused to let her move, how he had known before she did that something was wrong. Yes, he had saved her, more than once. Ellie nodded, reaching down to scratch Brody behind the ears. He did, and for the first time, she felt no doubt. Ellie thought the danger had passed. She thought, after the police patrols and the security cameras, after Matt's constant check-ins and Brody's unwavering watch, that whoever had been watching her had finally disappeared. She was wrong. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. Ellie had been sitting on the porch, watching Brody explore the yard. The sunset cast warm hues across the sky, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Then Brody stopped, went rigid. Ellie followed his gaze, and her heart dropped. A figure stood at the edge of her property, watching. The shadows made it impossible to see the face, but Ellie didn't need to. She knew. Brody snapped into action. The little dog charged forward, barking so fiercely it startled Ellie herself. His small frame was a wall of unshakable determination between her and the intruder. The figure hesitated, then turned and ran. Brody didn't stop barking until the intruder was completely out of sight. Ellie collapsed onto the porch, her hands shaking. Brody ran back to her, his small body pressing against her legs, as if asking if she was okay. Ellie buried her face in his fur. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Because of you." The police arrived within minutes. Matt was there too, his face tight with worry. This time they had more than just footprints. Security footage caught the figure clearly. It was someone from town. A man Ellie barely knew, someone who had been watching her for weeks. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to the officers discuss his arrest. But when she looked down at Brody, she felt something else. Relief. Because this time, there was no doubt. The danger was over, and Brody had ended it. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting golden hues over the wooden countertops. Ellie stood by the sink, watching Brody as he lay curled up on his favorite rug near the fireplace. His mismatched eyes were half closed, his small body rising and falling in steady breaths. It had been months since the night that changed everything, since Brody had stood between her and the stranger lurking outside, since he had chased away the fear that had lived in her home for far too long. And now, Ellie could finally say that she felt safe again. She turned back to the window, cradling her coffee mug in both hands, watching as the wind rustled through the trees. The world outside had returned to normal. No more footsteps in the night, no more shadows at the edge of the woods. But one thing had remained unchanged. Brody. He was still there, still watching, still protecting. And Ellie knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes from time, that he always would be. Ellie never thought she would adopt another dog after Jim passed. She had convinced herself that part of her life was over, that her heart had no room left to love something so fragile, so dependent. But Brody had proven her wrong. Because it wasn't about saving him. It was about him saving her. She had found him in the middle of a storm, but the truth was, she had been in her own kind of storm for years. A storm of loneliness, a storm of grief, a storm of thinking she had to face the world alone. And yet, here he was, curled up by her feet as she read her books, following her through the house as if making sure she never strayed too far, pressing his small body against her legs when the memories of Jim felt too heavy. She had thought she was rescuing him. But Brody had been rescuing her all along. Word about Brody had spread through town. At first, it was just whispers at the general store, murmurs of how Ellie had taken in a broken dog, how she was wasting her time on something that was never meant to survive. But then the story changed. People saw Brody running beside Ellie on their morning walks. They saw the way he stood by her side, confident, strong, unshaken. They saw the way he had fought for her, the way he had protected her. And suddenly, the whispers weren't about how fragile he was anymore. They were about how strong he had become, how love had made him whole. One afternoon, Ellie took Brody to the small community center in town where the local nursing home held weekly social events. She hadn't planned to stay long, just a short visit to say hello to some of the people she knew. But Brody had other plans. The moment they walked in, his tail wagged, his ears perked up, and then, without hesitation, he trotted toward one of the elderly men sitting alone near the window. Ellie watched, heart swelling, as Brody placed his small paws gently on the man's knee. The man, Mr. Thompson, who had lost his wife last year, looked down, surprise flashing in his tired eyes. Brody let out a small whine, then pressed his head against the man's hand. And just like that, the man smiled. Ellie had seen a lot of things since bringing Brody home. But this was something else entirely. This was Brody knowing instinctively where love was needed. This was him giving the kind of comfort Ellie herself had once needed. And that day, as she watched Brody move from person to person, bringing laughter, bringing warmth, bringing something unspoken but deeply felt, Ellie realized something. He hadn't just been meant for her. He had been meant for everyone. A few days later, Ellie sat on her porch watching Brody chase butterflies across the yard. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft pinks and purples, and for the first time in a long time, Ellie felt at peace. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A car pulling up to her driveway. The driver stepped out, a woman in her mid-30s with hesitant eyes, and an envelope clutched tightly in her hands. Ellie frowned. "Can I help you?" The woman took a deep breath. I think you have my dog." Ellie's heart stopped. Brody, who had been rolling in the grass, lifted his head. His ears twitched. The woman knelt, holding out her hand. "Hey, baby," she whispered. "It's me." But Brody didn't move. Ellie swallowed hard, forcing herself to ask, "You abandoned him?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "No," she choked out. "I didn't. She inhaled sharply. "I was scared." Ellie felt her grip tighten on the porch railing. The woman continued, voice shaking. "I found out he had problems, that he might not make it. And I thought—" She swallowed hard. "I thought letting him go was kinder than watching him suffer." Ellie's breath came slow and measured. She looked at Brody, at the strong, unshakable dog he had become. Then she looked at the woman, a stranger who had once given up on him. And in that moment, Ellie made a decision. She knelt down, stroked Brody's fur, and whispered softly, "It's your choice." Brody looked at her, then at the woman, and then he stepped closer to Ellie, not to the woman who had left him, to the woman who had chosen him. Ellie exhaled. She stood, meeting the woman's tear-filled eyes. "I think," she said gently, "he already has a home." The woman nodded, her face a mix of sadness and relief. "I think you're right." And as she drove away, Ellie reached down, running her fingers through Brody's fur. "You were never broken," she murmured. "You just needed someone to see you." Brody let out a soft sigh, curling against her legs, and Ellie knew. He had made his choice. The days passed, turning into seasons, and Brody never left her side. Through the cold winters and warm summers, through the quiet evenings and long walks in town. He was there when Ellie laughed, there when she cried, there when the weight of missing Jim grew a little too heavy. He was there not just as her dog, but as her family. And one afternoon, as Ellie sat on the porch with Brody at her feet, she whispered something she had only ever said to Jim. "I love you." Brody lifted his head, nuzzling against her hand, and she swore. In his mismatched eyes, she saw the same love reflected back at her. Because love wasn't just about where you started. It was about who you chose. And in the end, Brody had chosen her. At its heart, Brody's story is about more than just a dog overcoming adversity. It is a testament to the power of love, second chances, and the unbreakable bonds that form when two souls find each other at the right moment. Ellie, a woman who had long since resigned herself to solitude, never expected to open her heart again. She had known love, had lost it, and believed that chapter of her life was over. But Brody, small, fragile, and deemed broken by the world, came into her life and taught her that love never truly disappears. It only changes form, waiting for someone brave enough to embrace it again. Brody himself is proof that being different doesn't mean being unworthy. Born with physical challenges, abandoned because he was seen as weak, he was given a chance by someone who refused to see him as less than whole. And in return, he gave Ellie something she never realized she was missing: a reason to hope, a reason to trust, and a reason to believe in life again. But beyond just their story, Brody represents all the lives that are overlooked, the ones people dismiss too easily. How often do we pass by something, or someone, assuming they are too damaged, too far gone, too difficult to save? This story reminds us that kindness has the power to change everything, that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say, "I see you, you matter." In the end, Brody wasn't just a dog Ellie saved. He was the one who saved her, and that is the true beauty of their story. Love, in its purest form, is about choosing each other, even when the world says it isn't worth the effort. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.